Hello and welcome to Days of Learning Podcast. I'm your host, David Nelson, and Days of Learning Podcast is the show that explores health, wellness, medicine, and community engagement. We're so thrilled to be sponsored by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Wisconsin Department of Health, Milwaukee County organizations promoting prevention, and of course, my employer, the Medical College of Wisconsin. Today, I am super excited and thrilled to welcome Sophia Torrijos Mcgee, the Executive Director of Friedens Food Pantries. Welcome, Sophia.
Hi, Dr. Nelson. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so good to see you. Please call me David. Sophia has been the executive director since 2019. And for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with Frieden's Food Pantries, it is a series. And I should say in complete transparency, I'm a board member of Frieden's Food Pantries. And so I've known Sophia for a while. We are a food pantry that supports the food needs of Milwaukee citizens. But Sophia has taken an active role in developing robust programming around food access, food waste, sustainability, and community health and well-being. During her time at Friedens, she has introduced new best practice models and is currently oversees the Dispenza Pantry's transition to a community food center. I want to talk about that today. Her people-centered style and innovative and collaborative approach to creating solutions continues to build Frieden's legacy of transcending the limits of traditional food pantry. Sophia has a bachelor's degree in international affairs and history from Marquette University and is working toward a master's in nonprofit management and leadership from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Sophia was born in Spain, raised in Iowa, but considers Milwaukee her home. We span about half the world there, Sophia. So welcome to the show, and it's so good to have to spend some time with you talking about Friedens, community health, equity, and anything else that we might talk about. But first, I've got to ask you, Spain, Iowa, Milwaukee, how did that come to be? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I always joke that Iowa and Spain are kind of like oil and water. They don't seem like they would mix very well, and sometimes they don't. But it kind of did. They eventually did come together to create me. So. You know, my dad's from Spain, my mom is from Iowa, and they met in college. They were married in the US and then moved to Spain where they had me. And I think I was only 1 year old when they eventually moved back. I have to remember sometimes that in the 90s, you couldn't just pick up the phone and video chat with your family. So definitely the world is maybe a lot smaller today, but you know, the way I grew up, it wasn't until much later in my life that I realized how untraditional it was, and maybe I always had a sense because I felt a little bit different than my peers. But I would spend school years with mom in Iowa, and then my entire summers would be with my dad in Spain. And so I think from an early age, it kind of sparked this curiosity in me about, you know, oh, this is. My two families do things really differently and live really differently, and also sort of I call it this a cultural chameleon, where oftentimes children who are brought up that way, I think you learn to adapt to your surroundings and try to fit in whatever community you are in at that time. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned this idea of curiosity, and knowing you as I do, that's an interesting way to describe yourself. Tell us how your experience of spending time internationally and spending time stateside with family in both sides in two continents, how that shaped this curiosity.
Yeah. That's an interesting question, because I'm actually kind of just right now in this moment realizing that a lot of what I experienced growing up has kind of maybe led me down this path to where I am today, where I think that sense of belonging is something we all crave, and certainly is sometimes difficult to find. I mean, I often I often felt growing up like, oh, you know, obviously I'm fluent in English and Spanish, but even that's not enough sometimes to kind of bridge the gap. When are you Spanish enough? Are you American enough? Um, and maybe sense of belonging was this kind of thing that you're always looking for. And eventually, you know, when I did move to Milwaukee, um, I I think I was one of those students who enters undecided, and probably even towards graduation, I was like, I am still not sure what I am meant to be doing. Um, and in truth, Milwaukee didn't feel like a place where I belonged for a long time. Um, I think sometimes what can happen is that, especially when we're on our kind of a campus bubble, if you will, there's um, I think there was some tension between the university campus and the surrounding community, and so a lot of the narratives that I was hearing about this place that I now call home, those narratives were kind of scary. It was like, oh, there's a lot of crime in this city, or there's a lot of drug use in this city. There's a lot of poverty and segregation, and these were the lenses with which I was viewing Milwaukee for a really long time. But I'm glad that my what you alluded to, I guess maybe my sense of curiosity kind of led me to connect with some people in the community. It was one of those kind of, I cold called the director at the time of Friedens, and I said, hey, I'd really like to set up an internship with you. And little did I know how much that internship would just kind of be this domino effect to so many other things.
So hold on a minute. Hold on a minute.
Okay.
Hang on. You cold called. So what did you do?
So I had some time over that. I was doing a research fellowship. I was which was really, really cool. I got to interview women who had immigrated from Mexico, and that was just a super cool experience. And I thought, well, I have a little bit of time too, and I like this kind of this community work, and I think I should set up an internship or something where I can kind of explore this. There's something there that is really meaningful, and I got a lot of satisfaction from it. And so I asked around, to be honest with you, because I wasn't familiar with. I really hadn't ventured off campus all that much. And I was referred to Friedens, actually, as an organization that they were really kind of walking the walk, and they were embedded in community. And the director at the time, and I guess still to this day, because now it's funny how that happens, it's kind of one of those things where even if you're the director and you have a lot of vision about the organization, you're still kind of on the ground doing the work. So I called up Catherine at the time, and I said, hey, can I be your intern for the summer? I'll do whatever you want me to do. And it just, I started to spend some time at the food pantry. And the first time I walked in, it's almost like, in some ways, it kind of confirmed a lot of the fears that I had. Because I walked in and I was, I think, probably one of like a handful of white people. And you know, even though it was maybe only 5 blocks from campus. And so it was just kind of like, it was new for me to kind of build relationships with the folks around me. And eventually I found that I was useful. There was a lot I could do to help the food pantry. And it kind of snowballed into, suddenly I did a year of AmeriCorps at the food pantry, and made a lot of friends I never thought I would, which kind of changed my perspective of the city and if I belonged or not.
So you started as a volunteer.
Yeah.
And I got to say, it's rare that someone says, use me however you want. Having worked with a lot of nonprofits, we don't get that too often. Usually it's, hey, can I come see this for an afternoon or a morning? And hey, that's good enough. Thanks for the experience. But you came and volunteered. Then you were an AmeriCorps for a year.
Mm-hmm.
But then you did a couple of other things. Talk about what else you did following this experience.
Yeah. I think I'm I mentioned I was definitely uncomfortable when I first started as a volunteer. Um, but I think that leaning into it was something that I just eventually embraced and kind of became this thing I've always been doing, which is, all right, what's next? Let me just keep going deeper with this. And it led me to take a position as a community organizer on Milwaukee's South Side. So um, Milwaukee, being a very segregated city, one of the most segregated in the United States, the South Side is predominantly Latino, folks from Mexico, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Colombia. It's really like it's incredibly diverse, and also folks who've been in the neighborhood for a long, long time. Um, African Americans, it's a really, really diverse part of the city. Um, but I took this job as a community organizer partly because I liked building relationships, but I didn't really actually understand what community organizing was. Um, and so the longer I did the work, um, I started to learn some really, really important lessons that, you know, about what your assets are, right? Like, what is a community's, what do you build on? How do you solve problems together? Who needs to be at the table to solve problems? Um, how do you create trust amongst people who are really, really different? Even myself, who, even though I can speak the language and culturally there are a lot of similarities, like I'm really different from some of the neighbors too. And so we kind of all went on this journey together where I was growing, personally and professionally, and I saw that with the neighbors too. Um, and I'm incredibly proud of everything we accomplished over the course of 2 years, 2 years in that neighborhood.
You started off with this notion of curiosity as a note that I made, and then spoke into this idea of sense of belonging, which I think is important for all of us. You used a phrase that I will often use, this idea of leaning into something. And I think that there's something to community engagement that we speak of leaning into it, because you said some really important things, this idea of relationship building, the idea of asking questions. It's easy in a city like Milwaukee or in any large metropolitan area to think about the deficits that exist in that area. But mostly, if we think about it, there are people and there are environmental resources that we should be looking at and leaning into. But you also mentioned a journey. And in that journey, you said a very important word that I want you to say a little bit more about, this idea of trust.
Mm.
Tell us how trust was important to you as a community organizer.
Mm-hmm. Trust was foundational. Um, Without it, you can't make any progress. Um, I think that when you begin to understand the experiences of many of the neighbors who live in communities like Muskego Way neighborhood, which is where I was working, there's been so much trauma that people have experienced in so many different ways, often at the hands of the authority or people who have maybe presented themselves as there to help. There's been so much trauma that people are right to take some time to form a relationship, um, and people are so good at, they know if you're genuine, they know if you really care, and so it wasn't until we took the time to understand each other and understand each other's different perspectives and understand what what motivates Claribel, right? What motivates Maria? What are those things that are going to get those neighbors to want to actually participate in change happening in the neighborhood? Not even just participate, but like actually propel that change, and plant the seeds. And so trust took a lot of time. I think people really underestimate how long that process can take. But if you're not willing to put in the time and the effort, you really won't get anywhere. You know, it wasn't until my probably fifth, sixth, seventh visit to a particular block that I would eventually maybe get invited in to have coffee, right? And then we're having coffee, and that's like when the real stories happen, right? The stories you hear first are, oh, there's drug dealing on my street, or, you know, there's sex trafficking on my street, and that's concerning to me. But the real stories kind of happen once someone lets you in and they say, you know, I'm so afraid of being deported that I drive 5 miles under the speed limit, and I've had to talk to my elementary school aged children about what is our plan if mom and dad get you know, sent back to Mexico. Where do you guys want to live, and where are you going to school? And that's the kind of plans that families are making behind closed doors. That's the kind of fears, and that's what's really motivating to people, is they just want safety for their family. But it took a long time to get there, right? And
Respond to that when
Mhm.
someone says, I'm really concerned about staying in the US. What would be your response?
It's challenging to respond to that. I mean, you're feeling a lot of things in that moment. I mean, you're feeling angry that a family has to have that constantly hanging over them. I mean, that is traumatic, and that makes me angry, and your heart breaks, and you know, and ultimately you care so deeply because you've spent the time to build that relationship. Um, but I think that what we have to do for each other is say, you know, there's some things that are not right, um, and acknowledge, you know, acknowledge that that's someone's situation, but what can we do about it? And I think that the more people can connect with their neighbors who may be experiencing similar things, is when people start to realize, like, I'm not alone, and I'm not just one person who feels this way. And maybe if we kind of work together, we can actually do something to change, even if it's just our block. And that feeling can be really empowering. And so um, it doesn't necessarily make some things right, but we can do what we can today to make some other things right.
Yeah, I've used the phrase of bearing witness, and I think there's an important thing to be being present for someone, even if you can't necessarily change the status of their situation, whether it be about an immigration status or someone's health status, but being genuinely present and just saying, you know what, we'll bear this together, I think gives people confidence, and gives them, it's a bit of an overused phrase, but it allows them to empower themselves in that particular situation, to say that someone cares enough to sit with me, even if it's over coffee. And I don't need them to solve my problems, but
Yeah.
I need people to be a friend to me in this
Yeah.
space.
Yeah, I think I mean, what you're talking about is having safe spaces to be ourselves, and a safe space where, um, you know, you may have to walk out the door and face a whole host of things, but at least while you're in here, there's some respite, and um, you can know that you're surrounded by people, or even just one-on-one, someone who um, is there for you.
Sophia, you've told me about this story. You said that this idea of building place, and building in, you can change things even in a block. Talk about the experience of how you've used that community engagement and that trust building to make a small change that mattered to the community.
Hmm. Yeah, it's one of my favorite individuals that I still to this day talk to her, because she was um, an amazing influence on me and inspiration for me, Claribel. She had, we got connected because somebody, she had reached out to somebody about this kind of, I'm not even going to call it a garden on her street corner because it was truly abandoned. It just looked like a big pile of weeds. And she was trying to figure out like who wants to do something about this. And so we got connected, and I said, well, why don't we, let's knock on some doors and see what happens. And I remember her initial reaction was, oh no, I know my neighbors. They're not interested in this. Like, we don't even say hi. Like, I would just be bothering them if I knocked. And I said, okay, well, that's fair, right? But why don't we just try and see what happens? And we spend the afternoon knocking on some doors and talking to the people who lived around there. And by the end of it, Claribel turns to me and she's like, wow, I lived right next to people and I had no idea they were this nice. And I had no idea that we were all on the same page, that this garden or jungle of weeds, we all hate it. So that was a really, I mean, it sounds kind of small, but it's also this huge first step. And that's not to say that every single kind of organizing is really hard and not every single kind of experience leads to this kind of eureka moment. But in this case, it was awesome. And eventually we kind of got some neighbors together, got some of the people from the neighborhood together, and we worked on this garden, pulled all the weeds. There's one story, Claribel goes out there with, she just had some gardening tools because she's just a hobby gardener, and she's trying to get these weeds that have been in there for probably 3 years. And the mechanic across the street, he's watching, and he's like, oh man, like, poor thing can't get all these weeds. So he goes out there the next afternoon. Nobody even had to ask him, and he had like special tools to till the soil and get all of that out there really quickly, all of the weeds out quickly. And just so many little moments like that where because everyone walking down the street kind of saw, oh, look, these folks are doing something good on this corner. You'd have people stop and say, hey, what are you doing? Or like, hey, do you need help? I can come back tomorrow and help you pull some of these weeds. Until, 3 years later, and now we have this thriving garden, and Claribel is hosting her own community meetings, right? That didn't happen the first year, but by year 3, she had grown in so much confidence, and she had gained capacity as a leader, and really found her own kind of inner power, and that kind of transformed that block, so that now suddenly it's like, hey, let's put up this awesome sign, or like, we should get a mural here too, or let's start composting, let's start beekeeping workshops. And it just gets bigger and bigger, and more people are interested. And it took one person knocking on a neighbor's door. So
let the record show that Sophia Torrijos is not afraid to cold call, and she's not afraid to knock on doors.
no.
But I have a colleague who talks about, when we talk about the food space, the food is important. But the food is a way, and the garden is a way to build that relationship. And you use
Mm-hmm.
that word power again.
Mm-hmm.
And the confidence that you can instill in somebody because you took the time to say, well, let's just try. And too often people stop themselves because they go, yeah, I'm not going to try. I it's too big of an issue. Nobody will want to help me.
Yeah.
And people did. So you've now been in this position for about a year as the executive director, who's not afraid to knock on doors. What have you seen in that year's time?
Yeah. So coming back to Friedens, my year of AmeriCorps was transformative for me, and then having the opportunity to come back in this position was huge, because one of the things that hasn't changed about Friedens is this incredible foundation it laid for me and for countless other young individuals who've gotten involved with the work, and these values that are kind of carefully instilled. That really frame the work. And so one thing I kind of learned about community organizing that I think that it also applies to Friedens and applies to many other community work is that the end product is really important, right? Whether you are trying to create a community garden or whether you're trying to do something a lot bigger, like create a community food center, the end product is super important, but it's also the process and the way in which you approach that process that is equally as important. And so what I often saw with neighbors, for example, is that, you know, we might have started with a certain goal in mind, but along the way, they were learning in such a way that maybe they changed their mind and they want to do something else, and that's fine. But they learned skills that are going to take them throughout their entire, you know, as long as they're going to live on the block. And so what I love about Friedens is that the way in which we approach the work and the process that we have is incredibly collaborative. It's incredibly honest and welcoming. And it's, in a sense, you know, the food is as important as the way in which we bring people along on the journey and involve people in the work. So for example, while we're building this community food center, about, you know, a good percentage of the people that are involved in the laying of the blocks, figuratively, are also individuals who are affected by the issues that we are confronting. So individuals who are experiencing homelessness, who are experiencing food insecurity, they may be recovering addicts, they may be addicts, right? But finding places for people in the work so that there's ownership, I think, is what we're building, so that this is something lasting, because it's rooted in community.
We speak of, if you wake up with the issue, then that's your community.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people that you're talking about really do wake up with this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Give us a little bit of a overview of what Friedens is, who they serve, where they serve, just to give our listeners a little bit more of the context.
Yeah, absolutely. So Friedens, 40-year history in which we've changed so much. We've grown into the largest network of food pantries in Milwaukee. So we have 2 Southside locations and 2 Northside locations, and each one is really neighborhood based and reflective of the people who live there and the unique issues that kind of arise in each community. Unfortunately, one of the issues that is pretty pervasive across the city is food insecurity. And last year, so in 2019, Frieden served 65,000 people and met their food needs. And so that could be anything from just needing emergency food to needing a safe space to hang out. Honestly, I think a lot of our pantries kind of have this dual function as a community center and safe space. A lot of the food that we provide is recovered, and so sustainability is becoming an even more prominent issue for us. I don't even think we realized for so long, like, hey, we're recovering 500,000 pounds of food a year that would otherwise end up in landfills. That's huge. So that's something really cool. And now, kind of the latest iteration of Friedens is really trying to use a more holistic approach to addressing a lot of the health and well-being needs of our community members. And so folks can certainly come for food, but I think we're asking ourselves kind of, well, what else, right? Folks are here. How can we help? How can we help further get them from point A to point B?
So I think it's been more popular, if that's the right phrase or not. It's been more known. I don't want this to be a popularity thing. It's been more known about food security, in that people are either worried about not having enough or they don't have enough.
Mm-hmm.
You work with a lot of people who don't have enough food. What's that like for a family?
I think that food being a basic thing we all need, there's a lot of chronic stress that comes with that. When you need, well, the goal is to have 3 meals a day. And, when you're constantly kind of spinning your gears trying to just get basic things on the table. That's incredibly stressful. And then I think there's this kind of, I don't know if it's a side effect, but it's like this shame of like, why can't I provide for my family? The examples that stick out to me the most are families who have come to our food pantries for the first time. So I've personally walked folks through our food pantry. We use a co-shopping model. So we don't pre-bag food for people. We incorporate choice into what we do. And so walking a family through, and just tears. Just, it took so much for someone to kind of acknowledge that I need help today, and how heartbreaking that is. But also, it's amazing to some people to know that most of the people who come to our food pantry also work. They might have more than one job. So it's not, I think there's all this shame wrapped up in it, but I sometimes think that blame is misplaced. Like, if you're working and you're working at least 40 hours a week and you still can't provide food, that tells you something about the systems that are creating inequality. So just, you meet so many families who, it's just the stress of wanting to get ahead, but also having to juggle all these different appointments just to get help, and the bus schedule, and do I have childcare, and then food, like, and if you haven't eaten all day, I mean, I don't know about you, but I remember, I'm thinking about if I skip breakfast, sometimes I'm like, no one wants to be around me. So if that's your daily experience.
As you described that, I was thinking about the stress, and I was thinking about, my phrase in my mind was, man, that's a lot to juggle. That's a lot to manage, because you mentioned several things. You mentioned the idea of the tears. And, oftentimes when we're stressed, as tears are a response to that stress. But I can also imagine, I've seen tears of relief from people who suddenly somebody's going to either help me or support me in order to help my family. It's one less thing that I can take off. It doesn't mitigate the other things, but it's that one thing. And then you mentioned the time it takes, whether it be the bus schedules, or the missing the work schedules, or if someone's watching the children's schedules. It's a lot to manage for any one of us.
Yeah, I think I can think of many times that somebody, they might come to the food pantry, and sometimes they're just surprised at, oh, this is like really nice produce you have, right? And that makes them excited. It's something that they have to be excited about. And I love that, because not only are we able to meet someone's needs, but we're able to give them something that they, can go home and cook with. And especially for, a lot of our visitors who may be immigrants, they just meeting their needs in a culturally sensitive way too. I think that's it brings a lot of joy to the work too. And I've talked about this a lot with different people, but as many days as you're going to have your heart broken by the work, I think that when we all stop having fun, I think that's also kind of a problem too. Like, we need to be able to celebrate the success and the progress in people's lives as well.
I have a lot of work to do personally around this idea of cultural sensitivity and such. Can you teach me here? Tell me what you mean by supporting families in a culturally sensitive way. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, I've always thought of food as, I don't think many of us just sit down and just eat to eat. I think food is incredibly, it's an emotional experience. And when I think of every kind of milestone in life, whether that's the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, a wedding, a graduation, there's food, right? That's where we come together. It's where you break bread with folks and around a table, and it's where you talk and you get to know somebody and walls come down. And so food creates community. It's so powerful. And every kind of, I think for me, I'll speak from my own kind of cultural lens, is the paella, which is a rice dish served in Spain. It's served communally. Like they'll bring out this giant la paellera, and it's just full, and everyone just serves themselves. It's family style, and it's like nothing tastes like home more than when I'm having paella with my family. So I think that to not acknowledge those things when it comes to an organization that is serving people's food needs, I mean, that's a real shame. Like we can't pretend like that doesn't exist. And so, you know, oftentimes that's one of the beauties of the choice model, is you can allow people to kind of self-select or choose foods that they prefer. And sometimes not even prefer, but they might have dietary restrictions. They might be kosher. They might have an allergy. They know what their kids are going to eat, more than us. So, and they know how to prepare certain things. So I think that that's the approach that we're trying to build with a lot of the families.
So maybe on a future show we can have you make that dish. How would that be for us?
I'll have to call up my grandfather and
I think that
have
would be a
him
lot
send
of
one
fun.
over.
But I want you to say and tell us how that image, I love the idea of the image of the community meal, and I've never had it, but I can see it because I've watched enough television to know that I watch the food channels. That's what I do. How does that translate to our work?
I think that certainly we've discussed that families are struggling. They're struggling to put food on the table, to find housing, to find the resources and navigate these incredibly complicated systems. They're struggling. And helping them navigate all of that is incredibly important. But I think that what has allowed us as an organization to be somewhat successful at it is that we kind of start with trust as the basis. And trust happens over time, and trust can be built in a number of creative ways. And I think we've often used food as a way of kind of bringing people together, and not just sharing food together and preparing food together, but saying, hey, you matter. Why don't you help us set up the food pantry? Why don't you help me? This has happened to me before. I'm carrying all these boxes, and I'll say, hey, to someone standing outside. I'll say, hey, can you help me carry all this stuff? And they're like, sure. And because no one's ever asked them, right? It's not that people don't want to be a part of it. It's that, are we intentionally inviting people in? And so inviting folks to come and volunteer with us. I mean, I've seen the sense of belonging that it creates. This fluidity of, this isn't just the giver and this is the receiver. Everybody has something to give here, and everyone has something to receive. And so even if we don't solve food insecurity tomorrow, we're creating something beautiful today.
You used a phrase that I want you to drill down a little bit. And if you've never said it, I know you probably have thought it. What's it like for someone to hear you matter?
I think we need to think about the times in our life when we haven't felt like we mattered, or times in our life when someone has validated that we matter. We've all felt that in some way, shape, or form. We've all kind of felt othered sometimes, and how isolating it is to be someone on the outside, someone who's marginalized, someone who's not even just not seen, but I think we intentionally put up blinders to not see. And when you feel like you're screaming into a void, that's painful. And eventually I think people start to like really believe that about themselves. That they start to question, like, do I matter? So when I think of somebody who actually takes the time to listen and see you and get to know you, something is kind of built up in that person, and whether it's a confidence or a healing too. It seems so small, but it's so important. No matter whatever issue you're working on, if we're not taking the time to see people, then we're not going to heal anything.
That's a really beautiful way to say that, Sophia. So many of the people, having been in this space for thousands of hours, so many of the people are forgotten by the society at large. Whether they're called it, they're deemed expendable. They don't really matter to so many. But to our organization, it's a place where people can be safe and people can matter and can make a difference. And that is the cool thing. You've mentioned this concept of community food center. Mm-hmm. And I want you to describe what it is that we are trying to create there and what it may mean for that neighborhood and the community.
What excites me about our community food center, in part, is that I think we're building on what we're already really good at. So I think that in creating a space where people can come and not just receive emergency food, but explore all the different options around food and receive education around nutrition, and learn about the whole food life cycle. And while they're there, kind of able to access partnerships where somebody from legal services is there, or someone from a health profession is doing blood pressure checks, kind of wrapping all of that into one place, and ultimately stripping away some of the shame that is associated with accessing services. For me, I think the hallmark of what a community food center is it's a place where you can just go because you want to check it out. You don't actually need to be there. You don't have to go just because you need food that day. You can come and have a cup of coffee, and maybe there's a food demonstration taking place, or you can come and harvest something from the garden. But really, all of these avenues to connect with neighbors, while also kind of filling our own cups, and doing so in a way that is utterly reflective of the community. So it's not just it's truly run by people who live in that neighborhood, folks who can teach you about cooking from their country, and how much trust can be created in a place like that.
What is the stuff of that community then? What is the essence of it? I really want to get a description on that.
I think that's a tough question, because I think community can mean different things to different people, and that's okay. And ultimately, I think community is kind of how you define your larger family. And it can be something that you are born into, but it can be something that you create. And maybe it's this idea that when you are in your community, it's a place where a neighbor looks out for another neighbor, just because just because you are both identified, and you recognize each other's kind of common humanity. Hmm.
You know, you mentioned humanity, and I'm thinking, well, maybe there isn't a word or phrase. I was there last Saturday, and I was getting ready to do outreach on the street, and so I came to drop off
Zucchini.
zucchini. I heard you have good zucchini. Um, and I noticed I call it a buzz. There was a buzz.
Mm.
And it's this humanity thing, but there's an energy associated with it. And frankly, I think it goes back to maybe there's a component in the essence of this. There's a thread of safety
Mm.
and that sense of belonging and that sense of family. And it's all this mixed up because we've got, we might have 6 languages being spoken at any one time, 3 or 4 religions, and people are just doing their thing. Some are enjoying the sun and others are just flitting about doing what they do.
Mm. Yeah, there's a vibrancy that I think shines when people are happy being themselves. Um, and one time somebody asked me, why are there so many young kids just hanging around? Like, what are they doing here? I think it was a volunteer who was kind of new, and they maybe hadn't fully wrapped their heads around what we were doing. Why are so many young kids hanging around? And I was like, myself and a couple other colleagues were like, well, this is a safe place for them in this neighborhood. There's not a lot of outlets for teenagers to not, maybe get wrapped up in gang violence or drug violence. So yeah, they're hanging out, but they help too, but they're teenagers, so they they hang out and that's fun too.
And they certainly weren't referring to me when you said those young people.
Maybe not.
But at the same time, and I will say this and you might not remember it, but we've had many a time, I think especially in inclement weather when it's been cold out, where someone has fallen asleep and their cell phone might be charging because they don't have anywhere else to charge it. Yeah. But people just go, they're a little bit more quiet. Just let them sleep.
I can think of more than one occasion that has happened.
That's a part of that vibrancy too, though.
Yeah.
It's just it's a shade and a nuance and a different type of association with that. So this idea that there's this place where people can come and be themselves, how does that support the health of the community?
I think one of the biggest barriers for folks accessing services is knowing where to find them, trusting those services. Are the services available in their languages? I guess there's a lot of barriers, right? I don't even know if there's one that I could narrow in on, just the top one, but what we can do is try to strip away some of these barriers and create a model that is more accessible to people. I think that we've often commented on the fact that as a food pantry, we have folks who visit us once a month, sometimes once a week. We are already providing for, there might be a family that we're providing 50% of their monthly nutritional intake. That's already pretty powerful. And if we know that they're coming to our center, why would we not make it easier for them to kind of access the other resources that they need? It's food in and of itself is already such a kind of cornerstone of a healthy life. We know that there's plenty of research that shows that rates of obesity and high blood pressure and mental health are much higher in the neighborhoods that we serve. And so, providing someone with one component of a solution is providing them with a stable source of nutritious food, and teaching people how to use that food. So solving some of the access and the education parts of it. But if we really say that we're about, solving health, we can't just focus on our one little piece of the puzzle. That's where our amazing partners come in. And I think that with that collaboration and working smarter, not harder, we can wrap support around our families in a way that's getting us just a little bit closer to solving, to removing more of those barriers.
Maybe it's about not only the looking to solve these, but even in the moment, stabilizing just for that moment. Mm-hmm. And maybe because we know that time is a precious commodity for all of us, that if they don't have to go to another spot to get something else, mm-hmm. that it just stabilizes it for that moment.
Yeah.
You mentioned mental health, and I want to have you talk about this because too often we think of the food pantry as the place for food, but you also mentioned it as a place where people can be safe. How does it support mental health from your perspective?
Mental health is still one of those things that, I don't know, as a society, we are so uncomfortable talking about mental health issues. When in reality, it's like a pandemic of anxiety and depression that we're facing. And even more so, I mean, is it really all that shocking that, a child who is living in a house where they may not know where their next meal is coming from. They may hear gunshots at night. They may be feeling pressure to engage in things that they don't want to. It's not shocking that by the time many of the families come to our pantry, there's a lot going on that goes sometimes unseen or unspoken. The safety and stability, I think, that we provide, because we are their rain or shine. I mean, doesn't matter if it's an ice storm or any number of things. We're there, and that, I guess, like going back to that kind of feeling of mattering, right? And like, I may need to get this food, but I don't need to feel anxious about where the food is coming from, and I don't need to feel like an added burden of shame just to access it either. We don't have any like licensed psychologists on our team or anything like that. I mean, I've always thought it would be really, really cool, maybe future plans to kind of incorporate that into our model. But we have a lot of what I call like peer mentors. So folks that have been where our clients are. Many people who are really involved in the food organizing the food pantry, but they have also been food insecure. They have also been through really, traumatic experiences. And so these peer mentors can really walk with somebody in a way that feels so different than folks coming in from the outside and kind of that charity hand up. That doesn't always feel the same.
So maybe we're onto something here when we speak of stability, and it can become in the form of someone who just cares, and that can alleviate so much of life's hurts. Sophia, what do you see for the future for Frieden's food pantries?
Hmm. I wish I could say that for our future, I see us not even being needed. Um, and I do think that that future will come. Definitely not in my tenure, but um, I think we're working in that direction, and um, I'm I'm excited about our organization's future. I mean, we're trying new things, um, pushing the needle on issues that have been, I mean, embedded in the fabric of our society for so long. I mean, hundreds of years of we're a very, you know, in modern society that we have families hungry in this country, right? Um, so I'm just excited to see kind of what the community food center, how this continues to transform lives, and you know, the folks that develop and kind of find their own power just by getting involved in our pantries work.
I want to end with this question, and I think it fits with what you were just saying. What gives you hope?
This maybe this sounds strange coming from someone so young, but I have a lot of hope when I meet kind of the generations right before me, or younger than me. Um, I think that there is such like spunk and um, willingness to just I don't know how to describe it, but just willingness to throw themselves into the work that is really fun. I have loved getting inspired by the young people at the pantry, and I'm also very hopeful in our neighbors. I mean, it gives me a lot of hope to see projects that I started as a community organizer in the neighborhood that the pantry is located in, oddly enough, and those projects are still there, right? It doesn't mean every project is going to succeed, but the garden that we started on Mitchell Street is still there, and it's bigger, it's better. And that wasn't Sophia. That was the neighbors took that and owned it and ran with it. That's awesome.
You know, teachers come in all sizes, and as we know at our pantry, we have volunteers as young as 3, and I think our oldest pantry with one of our affiliated groups is 101.
Mm-hmm.
And you want the truth, speak to a 3-year-old. But there is hope in that next generation that maybe it's not so much a matter of getting it right, but making a different outcome to what we can see. When you talk about 60,000 families that we've supported, that's a pretty lasting impact. Even though it's a temporary thing, we know that it goes further than that. Sophia, anything else you want to tell us?
I think no, other than thank you for having me.
Sophia, tell people how to get a hold of us, get a hold of you, because I know that there's going to be people that may want to support Frieden's Food Pantries in some format. How can people get involved?
Sure. So if anybody wants to learn more about our work, you can visit us at friedenspantry.org. And I would, you know, be happy to connect with anyone in person. My email is director@friedenspantry.org. So I'd love for people to learn more about us, and I can answer any questions.
So she'll even take a cold call, I bet, wouldn't you?
I would probably take a cold call.
Sophia, it has been a wonderful experience. This has been joyful for me. I just really like your intensity, your genuineness, and truly your curiosity, and you belong at this organization. Thank you for joining us today on Days of Learning podcast.
Thank you.
Wow, what a show. Just when I think that they can't get any better, they get better. I really enjoyed how Sophia was able to describe a system that's a combination of place and people and concept. She mentioned early on this idea of sense of belonging and how she, as a child of both Spain and Iowa, strived to figure out where she might belong. And as she grew in her career and continues to grow in her career, she talks about the assets that exist within a neighborhood, the journeys that exist for people and places, and how we can acknowledge both people, the issues they find themselves, and perhaps we can do a little bit better by making the world a little bit more secure, decreasing stress even for a moment. We talked about this idea of our place at this food center as being a place of vibrancy, a place where people are safe to be themselves. And that maybe through this idea of food and having enough, that we can transform lives in the present and for the future. So maybe food security will be a thing of the past one day. Sophia, thank you for coming on the show, for being a part of this. We look forward to being with you next time on the Days of Learning podcast. I'm your host, David Nelson, and we thank you. Be well, and God bless.